The storm howled through the Wyoming plains like a wild beast, gnashing its teeth at anything that dared cross its path. Florence Elwood, frozen to the bone, kept her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, even though it was swallowed up by the thick snow. She'd fought through worse before, but the wind, that goddamn wind, it was something else. And today, she wasn't sure she'd make it through. The wind was a living thing out here. It didn't just blow, it howled and screeched, making you feel like it was biting at your very soul. Florence gripped the reins of the wagon harder, fingers numb and stiff from the cold, her skin turning pale beneath the layers of wool and leather she wore. But it wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay. The snow had been relentless, a furious tide that didn't care for anything but to swallow up the world around her. The wagon wheel had buckled miles back, right after the first gust of the storm had hit. Florence had tried to walk, dragging the trunk behind her, but with each step, her boots grew heavier, soaked through with ice and slush, her feet numb as stone. She'd thought she could make it. She'd thought she was strong enough for this. But now, with the prairie stretching endlessly before her and nothing but the howling wind behind her, she wasn't so sure anymore. Somewhere ahead, there had to be shelter. There had to be. Her bonnet had frozen stiff against her hair, ice forming in thick layers as she stumbled through the thickening snow. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the air biting at her lungs. She couldn't see the road anymore. It was gone, vanished under the swirling curtain of snow. And that's when she saw him. A shape cut through the storm ahead, a dark silhouette against the blinding white. Her heart skipped a beat, and she blinked through the freezing mist. Another figure appeared, a man hunched low against the storm, riding hard toward her. Her legs gave out before she even realized she was falling, and she sank to her knees in the snow, too weak to rise again. The cold was creeping in faster now, creeping into her bones. The rider pulled up fast, hooves pounding the snow-covered earth. He swung down from the saddle with a quickness that spoke of someone who knew this land, knew its dangers. Snow burst around him as he knelt beside her, his voice steady despite the fury of the storm. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and sure, not rattled by the wind. Florence opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips were trembling too hard, her chest too tight to force the words. But he didn't need them. He saw it anyway. The way she was barely holding on, her body too weak to fight the cold any longer. "I have you," he said. His eyes were sharp, dark as night, a quiet kind of certainty in them. "Not out here. Not like this." She couldn't speak. She just shook her head, her hands trembling in her lap. The storm raged on, but his presence was like a flame she didn't want to let go of. He pulled a thick, wool blanket from his saddle and wrapped it around her shoulders, lifting her like she weighed nothing, his arms strong and steady. "You're not alone," he said, his voice calm, almost tender. "Name's Cade Ellison." "Florence," she whispered, too exhausted to say more. The man didn't speak again. Instead, he lifted her onto his horse, settling behind her with ease. He held her steady against his chest as they rode into the storm, the world nothing but snow and wind. His arms were firm around her waist, unshakable. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his body through the layers of cloth and fur, and for the first time in days, she wasn't cold anymore. They rode for what seemed like hours, the snow blurring everything around them, but Cade never faltered. His horse, a big, black gelding with a white blaze down its nose, moved with a steady, unhurried pace, like it knew exactly where it was going, no matter how fierce the storm. Florence leaned back against him, her breath slow and steady now, the fear that had been gnawing at her for days starting to ebb away. She hadn't planned on dying out here today. She hadn't planned on dying at all. But in that moment, as they rode through the storm, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. The storm had slowed, but the cold was relentless. Snow still clung to every surface, but the wind had settled to a low, mournful whistle that seemed to follow them, urging them onward. Cade rode with a quiet determination, never once glancing back to check on Florence, though she was still tucked into his coat like she was part of him. His posture was unbroken, and she couldn't help but notice the way the horse seemed to follow his lead, calm, steady, purposeful. The cabin he led them to was a small, squat structure that looked like it had grown up from the land itself, built by hands that knew what it meant to fight for survival, to wrestle warmth from the bitter Wyoming winters. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcome sight after hours of nothing but the endless white of the prairie. When they dismounted, Cade was careful with her, still holding her steady as if she were as fragile as glass. Florence didn't speak as he led her inside. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said with every step they took, every motion he made. She felt the weight of it in the air between them, the silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but full of something deeper, unspoken. The warmth that hit her when they crossed the threshold was a shock to her system, and for a moment, she had to steady herself against the rough-hewn walls. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Cade moved with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime in this kind of solitude, his every action deliberate, unhurried. Florence sat by the fire, feeling the heat soak into her frozen limbs. Cade knelt in front of her, his hands gentle as he peeled off her boots, careful not to hurt her. She winced as his fingers touched the raw skin of her feet, but the pain was distant now, replaced by a profound sense of relief. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd been holding in, keeping it all together for the long walk, for the storm. But now, here in this warm cabin, it all seemed to break free, and she couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes. "Don't cry," Cade's voice was low, but it had a softness to it that made her blink. He wasn't one for words, and that was something she could understand. There was no pity in his voice, no hint of condescension, just the quiet certainty of someone who had seen enough to know how to keep his distance, yet still offer help when it was needed. Florence wiped her eyes, embarrassed, but when she looked up, he was already tending to the fire again, his back to her, giving her the space to regain her composure. "Why were you out there?" he asked after a while, his voice breaking the silence like a stone dropped in a quiet pond. Florence took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The words came slow, reluctant. "I was headed to Sheridan. I've got a teaching position there, or at least I thought I did." "Alone?" Cade's tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. She nodded. "Yeah," she whispered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Alone." Cade didn't say anything right away. Instead, he went to the table and brought back a cup of tea, handing it to her with a steady hand. Not many women would make that trip alone. Not many had much choice, he said, settling across from her, leaning back in the chair, arms crossed as he studied her. Florence's gaze dropped to the cup in her hands. She could feel the weight of his words, but she wasn't sure how to answer them. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "The town dried up. No more children. No more need for a teacher." Cade watched her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, like the wind had just died down. "It's a hard thing to lose a place like that. People, too." Florence looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was something in the way he said it, like he understood more than she was letting on. Something quiet and knowing. Maybe it was the same thing that had drawn her to him in the first place, this quiet strength, this steadiness that came from surviving a hard land, a hard life. The fire crackled, and the wind rattled the windows, but it was nothing compared to the silence that had settled between them. There was no need for more words. They stayed like that for a while, sitting in the small cabin, listening to the wind outside, letting the quiet fill the spaces between them. Morning came quietly, the pale light creeping across the snow-covered land. The wind had calmed, but the chill was still in the air, biting at the edges of everything. Florence woke to the sound of Cade moving around the cabin, his footsteps steady and purposeful. The fire still burned low in the hearth, the warmth wrapping around her like a blanket. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, before her mind caught up with her, and she remembered where she was. Cade was already at the stove, preparing breakfast. The smell of beans and eggs, thick and earthy, filled the small space. Florence rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the lingering exhaustion from the storm. She had slept through the night, the warmth of the cabin and the steady, calm presence of Cade easing her into a deep sleep she hadn't had in days. She pulled herself from the chair, her legs stiff, but feeling stronger now. She padded over to the fire, stretching out her arms to catch the last of the warmth before Cade turned and nodded toward the table. "Morning," he said, his voice as steady as ever, though there was a quiet kindness in it this time. "I made you some breakfast." "Thank you," Florence murmured, sitting down at the table. Her hands were still cold, but the ache was starting to fade, replaced by a slow but sure strength in her bones. She felt the weight of the quiet settle between them again, and for a moment, it wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. It was the kind of silence that felt right after the chaos of the storm. The snow outside still lay thick and deep, but the storm had passed. The world outside seemed quieter now, as if it was waiting for something. Maybe it was waiting for her. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Florence asked, picking at her food but not really hungry. She wasn't sure if it was the food or something deeper inside that made her feel unsettled. 2 days, maybe 3, Cade said as he turned back to the stove, adding more wood to the fire. "Trail's blocked, and it'll take some time before the wind dies down enough to ride through it. But you'll be safe here." His words were calm, but there was a kind of finality to them, as if he had no doubt that she would be all right, that they would be all right, even in the face of whatever lay ahead. Florence nodded, staring at the fire. She could feel the weight of the decision she hadn't yet made, the decision that was already hanging in the air between them. She was supposed to go to Sheridan. That was the plan. But now, in the warmth of this cabin, with the storm outside, that plan felt distant, like something she had left behind before she even got here. "I can take you to Sheridan once the trail clears," Cade said, as if reading her mind. "Might be a couple of days, but you'll make it there safe. If you still want to go." Florence looked up, meeting his eyes. She felt a twinge of something unfamiliar, something she hadn't quite recognized yet. Maybe it was trust, or maybe it was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She hadn't meant to say it like that, but it slipped out before she could stop herself. "I mean, you've already done so much. I don't want to be a burden." Cade didn't flinch at her words, didn't make a fuss over it. Instead, he just nodded once, his eyes steady. "I already owe you more than I can repay." Her chest tightened at that. She wasn't used to people offering help without expecting something in return. It was a strange thing, that quiet understanding. But it was there, between them. It made her uneasy and yet, oddly safe. "I'm not asking for payment," she said, the words coming out more firmly now. "You don't have to do anything more for me." She paused, looking down at her hands, trying to steady her thoughts. I think I need to figure out what I'm doing next. But for now, I'm here. And that's enough." The silence between them deepened. Cade set down his cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair, watching her. There was something in his gaze, something that made her feel both seen and unseen, as if he understood more about her than she'd let on, and yet, he didn't push. He just waited. The storm might have passed, but the quiet had settled in like the weight of something waiting to happen. They didn't need to say anything more. Not yet. The morning stretched out, slow and heavy. Outside, the world remained caught in its frozen grip, the snow piled high against the windows and the wind still gusting in the distance. The storm had passed, but its mark lingered in the air, cold and unrelenting. The land outside was silent, a vast, white wilderness that seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the cabin was a quiet refuge, a place of warmth that felt like a world apart from the wilderness beyond. Florence sat by the fire, her blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Cade had gone out to check on the horses, and she had stayed behind, uncertain of what to do with herself. The room was small, and though it felt homey in its own rugged way, there was still an unfamiliar quality to it. She'd grown used to the city, to bustling streets and the hum of life all around her. This was different. This was a place of stillness, of quiet that pressed in from all sides. She watched the flames flicker and dance in the hearth, the crackling sound filling the space around her. It was peaceful, in a way. But beneath the peace, there was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Something that pulled at her, made her think of things she hadn't thought of in years, things like belonging, like finding a place that fit, like letting go of what she had once known. Cade returned after a time, his boots heavy on the wood floor, the door creaking behind him as he stepped inside. He shook the snow from his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. He didn't speak right away but moved to the fire, adding more wood with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Florence didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything at all. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken thoughts, the kind of thoughts that had no clear answer, only time to sort through them. Cade finally broke the silence, his voice quiet, yet steady. "I'll take you to Sheridan once the trail clears. But you should know, it might be longer than I said. The pass could take a week to clear." Florence nodded, her fingers twisting around the edges of the blanket. She hadn't expected it to be easy. She knew the land out here didn't care for plans, didn't care for schedules. "I understand," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she did. She hadn't been prepared for this waiting, this stillness. She had expected to be moving forward, to be on her way to something new, to start fresh in a place she hoped would give her a second chance. But now, sitting in the warmth of Cade's cabin, she wasn't so sure. Something in her resisted the idea of moving on just yet. Maybe it was the quiet of the place, the way it seemed to hold her in its grip. Or maybe it was the way Cade seemed to belong to the land, like he was part of it, something steady and sure in a world that felt like it was always changing. "I'm not sure what I'm doing here," she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I came to Sheridan for the job. But now," she trailed off, her voice uncertain. "It feels like everything I planned is slipping through my fingers." Cade didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes," he said finally, his voice low, "life don't give us what we expect. But that don't mean we ain't meant to be where we end up." Florence swallowed, unsure of how to respond. His words lingered in the air between them, settling like dust. She wasn't sure she believed him, not yet. But there was something in the way he said it, something in the quiet confidence that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was right. Cade moved toward the table, setting down a small bundle of things, some dried meat, a few tins of food. "I'm going to head into town tomorrow," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Get some supplies, check on a few things. You can stay here and rest. I'll be back before nightfall." Florence nodded, not sure if she should protest or not. She wasn't sure what to feel anymore. She was grateful for his help, for his kindness, but it felt like a weight on her chest, the sense that something was changing, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly, her gaze shifting to the fire. "I can manage." Cade didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was calm, almost patient. "I know you can. But I'd rather not leave you here alone. Not after what you've been through." Florence bit her lip, staring into the flames. She wasn't sure if it was the fire's warmth or the steadiness in Cade's voice that made her feel suddenly so small, so vulnerable. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding back, how much she had been running from. "I don't want to be a burden," she said softly, barely a whisper. Cade moved closer, his presence steady and unwavering. "You ain't a burden, Florence. Not to me. And you're not alone. Not out here. She looked up then, meeting his eyes. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away, the storm outside, the uncertainty that had clung to her like a shadow since she'd left Kansas. In that brief silence, Florence realized something. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she felt it, something inside her, something she couldn't name, but it was there. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days that followed the storm seemed to stretch on, like the land itself was holding its breath. The snow still blanketed the ground, but the wind had calmed, leaving a stillness in the air that felt both oppressive and peaceful. Florence spent her time inside, resting, reading what little she had brought with her, or just watching Cade as he moved around the cabin. He was always doing something, whether it was tending to the fire, checking on the horses, or chopping wood for the coming days. He was a man of few words, but in his actions, he spoke volumes. Cade had offered to take her to Sheridan when the trail cleared, but Florence couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting inside her, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The longer she stayed in the cabin, the more she felt connected to the land, to this place that had seemed so foreign to her just days before. It was a land that didn't ask questions, didn't expect anything of her, it just was. And there was something comforting in that. She stood by the window one afternoon, watching the light shift across the snow-covered hills. The quiet was almost too much to bear, but it felt right in a way she couldn't explain. She wasn't sure what had brought her here, or why she had come this far, but she knew that the longer she stayed, the harder it was to imagine leaving. The sound of the door creaking open behind her broke her reverie. Cade had returned from his trip into town, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He hung his coat by the door and moved toward the fire, his movements purposeful, like he always knew exactly what needed to be done. "Did you find everything you needed?" Florence asked, not turning away from the window. She wasn't sure why she asked. It wasn't as though she needed to know the details of his trip, yet the question felt important somehow. "Found enough," Cade said gruffly, but his voice softened just slightly as he spoke. "Enough to get us through a few more days." Florence nodded, though her gaze remained on the hills outside. "I keep wondering if I should go to Sheridan," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the stillness of the room. "If I should keep going, or if this is where I'm supposed to be." Cade didn't respond right away, and for a moment, Florence thought he hadn't heard her. But then he stepped closer, his boots quiet against the floor. She could feel him behind her, even though she didn't turn to look at him. "You don't have to go to Sheridan if you don't want to," Cade said. "But if you do, you'll go when you're ready. No one's rushing you." Florence's fingers tightened around the edge of the windowsill. She hadn't expected him to say that, not after everything. She'd expected him to be the kind of man who wouldn't understand, who would think she needed to keep moving, keep chasing whatever it was that she thought she was supposed to find. But Cade wasn't like that. He didn't try to push her toward something. He just let her be, and somehow, that made all the difference. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for anymore," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I thought I knew. But I don't." The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding. Cade had spent enough years alone in this harsh land, fighting the elements and the loneliness, to know what it meant to be uncertain. He didn't try to fix it. He just let it sit there, and that was enough. "I think you've been looking for something your whole life," Cade said, his voice steady. "Maybe you'll find it here, maybe not. But this land, it'll wait. It doesn't rush. Doesn't ask for anything but a little patience. You got time." Florence finally turned, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. There was something steady in his gaze, something that made her feel like she was standing on solid ground for the first time since she'd left Kansas. Maybe Cade wasn't offering her answers. Maybe he wasn't trying to solve her problems. But in his quiet way, he was offering something more valuable than anything else she could have asked for, his presence, his steadiness, and the simple truth that she didn't have to decide everything right now. "I think I might stay a little longer," Florence said softly, her heart beating a little faster now, as if the decision had already been made. "I don't know what comes next. But maybe I don't have to know right away." Cade nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We'll figure it out," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. One day at a time. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, each one marked by small tasks, quiet moments, and the unspoken understanding that neither Florence nor Cade was rushing toward anything. Florence woke early every morning, the cold air biting at her skin, but it was bearable with the fire crackling in the hearth. Each day, she found herself doing more around the cabin, helping Cade with chores, preparing meals, learning the rhythm of life on the land. But each evening, as she sat by the fire, something inside her stirred. A question, unspoken but always present: what now? Cade had given her space to think, never pushing her to make a decision, and she appreciated that more than she could say. But the stillness of the land, its vast, unyielding silence, made the question even harder to ignore. The land didn't ask for answers, but it was impossible to avoid the questions it planted in her heart. She sat by the fire one evening, watching the flames flicker and dance, her mind far away. The cabin was warm, but she still felt the weight of the cold pressing against the walls. It wasn't the cold outside that bothered her, it was the cold inside her heart, the uncertainty that had crept in since the moment she arrived. Cade entered quietly, his heavy boots leaving tracks in the snow that had gathered in the doorway. He shook off the chill and moved toward the fire, his presence filling the small cabin with that same steady calm she'd grown used to. "Everything all right?" Cade asked, his voice gentle. It was the first time he'd asked in days. Florence looked up, meeting his eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "I don't know what I'm doing here, Cade. I thought I was going to Sheridan. I thought I had a plan. But now..." Her words trailed off, and the silence stretched between them. Cade didn't press her to explain further. He just watched her with that quiet understanding that seemed to settle over everything, like he was waiting for her to figure it out on her own. "Sometimes," he said after a long pause, "life don't give you a clear path. Sometimes you gotta find your own way through it. And that's not always easy." Florence stood, walking toward the window and staring out into the snow-covered night. The world outside was so still, so untouched. It felt like everything was waiting. "I came here to escape," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the stillness. "But now, I feel like I'm just standing still. Like I don't know what's next. Like I've lost something I can't get back." Cade's voice was steady, unhurried. "Maybe you didn't lose it. Maybe you just need time to find it again." Florence turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. There was something in his gaze that steadied her, something that made her believe for a moment that maybe, just maybe, the answers weren't as far away as they seemed. "I've spent my whole life trying to make everything fit," she said, her voice a little firmer now. "But maybe I don't have to have it all figured out. Maybe I don't have to keep running." Cade stepped closer, his presence warm in the cold cabin. "You don't," he said simply. "You're not the only one who's had to figure things out the hard way." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Florence's heart was beating a little faster now, her mind swirling with all the things she'd been running from for so long. She had come here thinking that leaving everything behind would fix it, but now, in this quiet cabin, she realized that maybe the thing she had been looking for wasn't somewhere else. Maybe it had been here all along. She looked out the window again, her gaze lingering on the hills that stretched out before her. The land was still, but it wasn't empty. It was full of life, full of stories that hadn't been told yet. Stories that could still be written. "I don't know what comes next," Florence said softly, turning back to Cade. "But I think I need to stay here a little longer. I think I need to find out if this is where I belong." Cade didn't say anything right away, but his gaze softened, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "I think you already know," he said, his voice quiet. "You just had to get out of your own way to see it." Florence smiled, the weight in her chest lightening just a little. She wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she didn't have to have all the answers right away. Maybe that was enough. The snow had begun to melt in the days that followed, the warmth of the sun finally breaking through the lingering chill of winter. It had been weeks since the storm, and the world outside the cabin was slowly waking up from its long slumber. The trees that had stood bare against the white landscape now began to show the faintest hint of green, the earth below them beginning to stir. The land, it seemed, was in no hurry, but it was moving forward all the same. Inside the cabin, Florence had found a rhythm. The stillness that had once felt suffocating was now comforting, like a blanket that wrapped around her, warm and soft. She had started helping Cade more with the work around the cabin, feeding the horses, mending the fences, chopping wood. Her hands were rougher than they had been in Kansas, but they were stronger too. The land was shaping her, and she was beginning to shape it in return. But even as she settled into this new routine, the question still lingered in the back of her mind: what was she really doing here? The land had become a part of her, yes. The stillness, the quiet, the work, it all felt like it had been waiting for her, like it was a place she could finally take root. But was that enough? Was it enough to stay, to build a life here when there were so many unknowns ahead? It was an afternoon much like the others when the question finally found its way to the surface. Florence had been standing outside, her coat pulled tight against the late spring chill, watching Cade work on the fence. She had become so accustomed to the rhythm of it all, the steady thud of the hammer, the careful placement of each post. But today, something about it felt different. She felt a stirring inside her, something that wouldn't be ignored. Cade straightened from his work and wiped the sweat from his brow, turning to face her as she approached. He seemed to sense something in the air, something that had shifted between them in the past few days. Florence didn't know how to begin, so she simply spoke. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "About staying here. About this place. About you." Cade set his hammer down and gave her his full attention. He didn't rush her, didn't ask for more than she was willing to give. He just waited, patient as always. "I never meant for things to go this way," Florence continued, her eyes focused on the ground at her feet, her words tumbling out faster than she could think. "I came here thinking I was going to find something. A job, a fresh start, a purpose. But I've been running away from something my whole life. From what happened in Kansas. From the people who never understood me. From the idea that maybe I'm not enough. I thought if I just kept moving, kept looking for something, I'd find it. But now," she took a deep breath, looking up at him. "Now I'm not so sure I need to keep running." Cade was silent for a moment, and Florence felt the weight of her words settle between them. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, maybe more of his usual calm. But when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "You don't have to keep running," Cade said, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. "Maybe you've been looking for something, Florence, but maybe you've already found it. Maybe it's not about finding something else. Maybe it's about finding peace where you are." Florence felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. She had known, deep down, that she didn't have to keep running. But hearing Cade say it, saying it so simply, made it feel real, made it feel like she wasn't just chasing after something that would never come. "I think I want to stay," she said quietly, the words more sure now than they had been before. "I think I want to build something here. I want to be a part of this place. Of this land. And of you." Cade stepped closer, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I'll be here," he said. "Whenever you're ready." Florence didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she was making the right choice or not. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't matter. She had found something here. Something she hadn't even known she was looking for. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. The land was still cold, but the warmth of the sun on her skin was enough. It was enough to tell her that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she needed to be. And as the wind swept across the land, she felt a sense of belonging settle into her heart. Spring in Wyoming came slowly, the earth waking up beneath a blanket of snow that had been stubborn to leave. It was as if the land needed time to adjust, to remember how to bloom after the harsh winter. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, and Florence found herself stepping more into the rhythm of this land that had begun to claim a part of her heart. She and Cade worked together, side by side, in the days that followed her decision to stay. The cabin, though sturdy, was small and had become too cramped with the passage of time and the weight of winter. Florence could feel the change in the air as they began planning for the future, a future that felt as uncertain as it was hopeful. Cade had always known the land. He had worked it, lived on it, breathed it. He didn't need to explain much about it, he let his hands do the talking. The fence needed mending, wood needed chopping, the garden needed tending to. Every task seemed small, but together they built something that was growing stronger each day. Florence felt the shift in herself as well, a change that started as a quiet thing, then grew louder as she found her place in the work. In the evenings, after the day's labor was done, they sat by the fire, tired but satisfied. Florence wasn't sure if it was the land or Cade himself that was shaping her, but she knew that something inside her was starting to settle, to grow into the life she had once thought was out of reach. They spent their days tending to the horses, clearing the land, making plans for a new schoolhouse that Florence had begun to dream about. She knew that teaching was her calling, but it wasn't just about the children she might teach. It was about creating something real, something lasting, a place where knowledge could grow like the crops in the fields, steady and sure. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, Cade turned to Florence with something new in his eyes. It was a look she hadn't seen before, one that was neither hard nor distant, but something else. Something that made her heart beat a little faster. "Been thinkin'," he said, his voice rough from a day of talking to the wind. "Maybe it's time we start buildin' that schoolhouse. If we're gonna do this, might as well do it right." Florence's heart skipped. It wasn't the schoolhouse itself that made her heart race, it was the way he said it, the way he looked at her as if they were already building something together. "That's a good idea," she said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse quickened. "I think we should. I think it's time." Cade nodded and fell into a thoughtful silence. Florence watched the firelight flicker across his face, the lines of exhaustion softened by the warmth of the hearth. There was something about this man, his steady strength, his quiet confidence, that made everything feel possible. Even when the work seemed endless, even when the land was hard and unyielding, it didn't feel like it was something she had to face alone. In the weeks that followed, the schoolhouse became a shared project. They spent days gathering materials, lumber from the nearby woods, stones from the river, and bricks that Cade had been saving for just this purpose. Florence spent hours sketching out plans, mapping the layout, imagining what the schoolhouse would look like when it was finished. The work was grueling. There were days when the weather turned, when the rain soaked through their clothes, or the wind picked up again and made every task feel like a battle. But each day, with each nail hammered, each board placed, it felt like something was taking root. The land was yielding, the earth working with them, just as Florence was starting to work with the life she had built here. One afternoon, as they set the frame for the walls, Cade paused to wipe his brow. He stood tall, looking over the land that stretched out before them, the open space filled with potential. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked, his voice soft as he glanced over at Florence. She wiped her hands on her apron, taking a moment to think. There was a certainty in her now that hadn't been there before. She looked out over the land, over the work they'd already done, and she knew that this was what she had been looking for. This place. This life. This man. "I think what comes next is whatever we make of it," Florence said, her voice quiet but steady. But I think we're already building it. Cade looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, Florence saw something flicker in his eyes, something soft and sure, a quiet recognition. He didn't speak, but his smile was enough. That evening, as they sat beneath the stars, their hands close but not quite touching, Florence felt the weight of the work they had yet to finish, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a promise that, no matter what, they would see it through. Together. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Florence knew that this was where she was meant to be. She had found something in this land, in this life, something that couldn't be taken away by the winds or the storms that would surely come. They had built something together, and it was something that would last. Spring had fully settled into the land by the time the schoolhouse was finally finished. It stood proudly in the clearing to the west of the cabin, a simple structure built from stone, wood, and care. The walls were sturdy, the roof strong, and as the last board was nailed into place, Florence stood back and surveyed their work. The schoolhouse wasn't just a building, it was a symbol, a promise of what they could create together. Florence had always dreamed of teaching, of guiding young minds and shaping futures, but this place, this land, had given her something she hadn't expected. It had given her a reason to stay, a reason to belong. She hadn't come to Wyoming looking for peace, but that was exactly what she had found. It was in the rhythm of the land, in the steady work, in the quiet strength that surrounded her every day. The land had become part of her, as had Cade. The two were inseparable now, like the land and the people who had fought to tame it. There was no other place she could imagine being. But even as they finished the schoolhouse, there was still much work to be done. They had to gather the children, those few families who lived scattered between the hills and the valleys. Cade had helped Florence make the rounds, speaking to ranchers and farmers, coaxing them to send their children to the school she was building. It was a slow process, one that required patience and trust, but by the time the first-class day arrived, there were enough children to fill the first few rows. Florence stood at the door of the schoolhouse, watching as the children arrived with their parents in tow. Some were young, barely able to sit still for the long walk, while others were older, their faces already hardened by the work they'd done on the land. There were no uniforms, no fancy books, just children with hope in their eyes, coming to learn in the simple building they had helped create together. As Cade helped settle the horses and make sure the families were settled, Florence felt something stir inside her, a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had never taught in a place like this, never faced a group of children who had grown up in the wilderness, knowing the harsh realities of life. But she was ready. She had found a purpose here, and it was more than just teaching. It was about showing them the strength she had learned from the land, the quiet resilience that it demanded. "Are you ready?" Cade asked, his voice low as he stepped up beside her, his gaze moving from the children to the schoolhouse. Florence nodded, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "I think so." "You've already got everything they need," Cade said. "They just need someone to show them how to believe in it." Florence smiled softly, a warmth blooming in her chest at his words. It was the same quiet confidence he had always shown her. And it was enough. She had everything she needed, too. She had Cade, and she had the land. And now, she had a chance to give back, to teach, to build, to show these children that there was something more to this land than just survival. There was life here. There was hope. She turned toward him, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Cade gave her a nod, his lips curling into a small smile. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. He had been there when she needed him most, and now, they were building something together. A future. The school bell rang then, a simple sound that echoed across the land. It wasn't just a call to begin the lessons, it was a call to something bigger. Florence took a deep breath, stepped inside the schoolhouse, and closed the door behind her. It wasn't just a school. It was the beginning of something she would build with her own hands, alongside the land and the man who had shown her what it meant to stand firm and not be afraid. And as the children took their seats, Florence began her first lesson, not just in math or reading, but in what it meant to build a life. To build a future. The spring had warmed the land fully now, and the fields that had once been covered in snow were beginning to show signs of life. The schoolhouse had taken root as much as the land had, and the children who came to Florence every morning brought with them the promise of a future that was slowly unfolding. They were eager, curious, just like Florence had been when she first arrived, though she had arrived with fewer hopes and more doubts than they would ever know. Life in Wyoming had become something she had never thought possible. She had come to this place running from her past, looking for something that could erase the failures she had left behind in Kansas. But in this land, surrounded by the silent hills and the quiet, steady rhythm of life, she had found something better than escape. She had found a home, a purpose, and someone to share it with. Cade. She hadn't expected to find love here, not in the midst of all the hardship and struggle that the land demanded. But in Cade, she had found a man who understood her in ways no one else ever had. He didn't ask for anything in return for the things he had done for her. He gave freely, and he made her believe in the possibility of love, even after everything that had happened. It was a quiet evening, one of those rare moments when the sun dipped low behind the hills and the world turned a deep shade of amber. Florence had just finished a lesson in the schoolhouse, and the children had gone home, their laughter still echoing in her ears as they ran across the fields. She stood on the porch, watching the sky as the light shifted, when Cade appeared, his steps heavy but purposeful, his face set in that familiar way he had when he was thinking about something. "You know," he said, stepping up beside her, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Florence turned toward him, her heart fluttering at the way he looked at her, steady, certain, yet soft in the way he always was. "What's that?" Cade took a deep breath, as if steadying himself for something. "I've been thinkin', we've built something here, Florence. Together. And I reckon there's no better time than now to make it official." Florence's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need him to finish the sentence. She already knew what he was asking. She had known for a while now, in the way his eyes held hers, in the way his presence had become as much a part of her life as the land itself. She smiled, her hand instinctively reaching for his. "Cade. Are you asking me to marry you?" He nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I reckon I am." Florence's heart swelled in her chest, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. It was a question that seemed so simple, but it held so much weight. What had started as a chance encounter in the middle of a snowstorm had become something more. It had become a life, a love, something built not on promises or grand gestures, but on the simple, steady rhythm of every day. "I'd like that," Florence said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that very much." Cade smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made the world seem a little less cold, a little more full. "Good," he said simply. "I'm glad." The days that followed were filled with preparations. The town was small, and word traveled fast, but Florence couldn't have cared less about the small, quiet wedding that was being planned. She wasn't interested in a grand celebration. What mattered to her was this land, this place, and the life they had already started building together. It wasn't much, no fancy dress or cake, but there were flowers picked from the hills, and the children made small bouquets from the wildflowers that had started to bloom. The sun was setting when Cade stood at the altar, small and simple, under a bough of trees with wildflowers strung between them, and Florence walked toward him, her heart in her chest, her feet steady on the earth she had come to love so much. The ceremony was short, quiet. The vows they spoke to one another were not grandiose, but they were honest. Florence didn't need a grand speech to know what she was committing to. She was committing to Cade, to this land, to the future they would build together. And Cade, in his own quiet way, was committing to her. To whatever came next, whatever storms they would face, whatever joys would come. They would face them together. When it was over, when the ceremony had ended and the guests had all gone home, Cade led Florence back to their cabin, his hand wrapped firmly around hers. They didn't need words. The world around them was quiet, the night air crisp, and everything seemed to be in its place. Florence leaned against the doorframe, her heart full as she watched Cade prepare a small fire in the hearth. The warmth of it filled the room, and she knew that everything had changed. She had found the love she had never expected, and in the stillness of the Wyoming hills, they had built something worth keeping. A home. A life. And now, a future. "I'll never leave you," Florence whispered, her voice soft in the quiet room. Cade looked up from the fire, his eyes steady. "And I'll never leave you either, Florence. We've made it this far, haven't we?" Florence smiled, her heart swelling with the certainty of it. "Yes, we have." And as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, they stood together, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side.